When hidden secrets come out, justice cannot be stopped. Ada's bravery gives three young girls the courage to share their own shocking stories. And how did Ada's pain turn into a light for others? Now let's dive in to the part 2 of the story. Ada sat still, her heart pounding and questioning if victory was ever going to be sure. After the day's trial, Deaconess Ifeoma was on her way to her car when a teenage girl approached her. The girl's name was Rachel. She was barely 17. Two other young girls, with their faces filled with both fear and resolve, stood behind Deaconess Ifeoma's car, also waiting for her. Their nervousness was palpable, but their determination was clear. They had heard of Patrick's trial and decided to speak up. Each of them told Deaconess Ifeoma their story and experience with Patrick. They all agreed to testify against him in court the following week. Ada's heart raced when she heard what they told Deaconess Ifeoma. She didn't expect she would hear that there were other girls with the same experience, but she admired their courage to speak up as she knew how difficult it was for her. She glanced at Deaconess Ifeoma, who gave her a knowing nod, a silent gesture that victory awaits. The day the case was adjourned to was finally here. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs and whispers, grew completely silent when the first girl was brought forward as a witness. Everyone was waiting, wondering what her story would reveal. Rachel was the first to speak. She cleared her throat, her voice shaky at first, but as she continued, her words grew firmer. "I met Mr. Patrick through my aunt," she began, her eyes now lifted to meet the judge's gaze. "He was a close friend of my auntie. He was always so kind, so eager to help. I looked up to him, but when he invited me to his house, things didn't feel right." Rachel paused, struggling to keep her composure. "He offered me water because I was thirsty, but soon after I did, I felt dizzy, like I couldn't think clearly. I don't remember much after that, but when I woke up, I was in a place I never should have been." The courtroom remained deathly silent. Ada's heart tightened as she listened to Rachel's words. She had felt that same dizziness, disorienting sensation, the same helplessness. But to hear another victim speak of it, it hit her in a way she couldn't have prepared for. She wasn't alone. There were others who had suffered in the same way she had. Rachel continued, "He told me not to worry, but I was scared. He would lay over me and I didn't know what to do." Rachel's voice cracked, but she looked out at the courtroom and nodded to herself, as though finding strength in her words. I don't know how to explain it." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she finished her testimony. She had spoken the truth, and now the weight of it seemed to crush her. The audience sat in stunned silence, some with their heads down, others wiping away their own tears. Before the courtroom could fully process Rachel's testimony, the second girl stepped forward. This was Grace, a young girl in her early 20s, her eyes red from crying, but determined not to let her fear control her. She walked to the stand with a sense of purpose that belied her youth. She had a quiet, resolute presence, and as she began to speak, her voice carried a strength that surprised even herself. Grace recounted her encounter with Patrick. "I had known Mr. Patrick for a while," she began, her voice steady. "I had always felt comfortable around him because he was our neighbor." Her hands shook slightly as she continued. "But that day, when he invited me to come into his house, I didn't feel it was right, but I trusted him. He insisted that I sit down and have a drink. I remember his insistence, the way he kept offering me more juice, even when I politely refused. I didn't know what was happening, but I started to feel dizzy. I couldn't focus. And before I knew it, I was lying on the bed with Mr. Patrick beside me. I couldn't move or speak. Grace paused, her voice breaking. I woke up hours later and I knew something had happened, but I couldn't explain it. I was too scared to even tell any of my family members, not until now. As Grace finished her testimony, her hands still shaking, but her shoulders square with newfound resolve. She looked out into the courtroom one last time. She had said what needed to be said, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. Her words hit home for many in the room. Grace, just like Rachel, had felt the discomfort and confusion of Patrick's manipulative behavior. The courtroom was eerily still as Grace finished. She had given voice to a terror that so many ladies before her had lived with in silence. The fact that two victims had now come forward was monumental. But it wasn't just the courage of these girls that shocked the room. It was the undeniable truth they carried. Patrick had done this before. He had done this to more than one girl, and now the walls of his deceit were crumbling. The air in the courtroom grew heavy as the third girl, Amara, the youngest of the three victims, took her place at the witness stand. She was just 16, barely more than a child, and yet here she was, about to speak a truth that had been buried deep within her for far too long. Her shoulders hunched, as if the weight of what she was about to reveal was almost too much to bear. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the witness stand, her fingers curling around the edges like a lifeline. Amara had always been a quiet, introspective girl, raised in a home where honesty and respect were core values. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her eyes, wide and uncertain, darted nervously over the room. But there was something different in her now. Something flickered in her gaze, a spark of courage that hadn't been there before. The fear that had haunted her for so long was slowly starting to give way to something stronger, the undeniable truth of her experience. As she looked down at her hands, she began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, almost a whisper, as if she was unsure whether the words would come out. "Mr. Patrick is my uncle," she began, pausing as though the weight of the words themselves took her by surprise. "He is my mother's younger brother." The room fell silent as the shocking revelation landed with a heavy thud. Amara looked up then, her eyes now meeting the judge's, steady and filled with resolve. "I thought he was just my uncle and someone I could look up to, someone I could actually trust. For 2 years," she continued, her voice growing firmer with each word, "I had to see him often. He would come to our house, just like any other family member. But whenever he visited, it wasn't normal. I didn't know how to say it then, but he would always find a way to pull me aside. He would tell me to come to the kitchen with him or to help him in another room. And when we were alone, he would touch me and eventually take advantage of me." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she forced herself to keep going. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, trying to keep herself composed. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, standing before all these strangers, speaking out about the shameful, terrifying moments that had haunted her for years. "He would always tell me not to say anything," Amara said, her voice small now, as though the mere memory of his words had the power to crush her. "He would tell me it was our little secret, that if I told anyone, they would never believe me, and I was too scared. I didn't know what to do. Sometimes he even threatened he would kill me if I dared tell anyone about our affair. He was my uncle, the one person I thought I could trust. Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment, she faltered. The weight of the secret that had burdened her for so long, threatening to break her down completely. She paused again, her chest tightening as she fought to push past the overwhelming emotions threatening to rise. The courtroom was still as a graveyard. The audience completely rapt, holding their breath, waiting for what Amara would say next. It wasn't just her words that held them. There was something in the way she spoke, the quiet power in her voice that demanded their attention. This was the voice of a victim, a girl who had lived in fear, but who was now taking back control of her story. I was too scared to tell my mother, Amara continued, her voice trembling with the raw vulnerability of her confession. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. And I also didn't want to cause trouble for my family. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to shake off the memories that clung to her like a suffocating fog. I didn't understand what he was doing to me. At first, I was too young, too confused, and I thought it was my fault, somehow. Amara's words hung in the air like a heavy silence. The room was filled with a deep collective sorrow. The audience could feel the weight of her pain, the years of suffering she had endured in silence, all because she was too afraid to speak out. But now, here in this courtroom, Amara was finally finding her voice. She was no longer the frightened, confused girl who had been silenced by fear. She was a young girl who was determined to be heard. Now, I feel safe enough to speak up, she said, after listening to Ada's story, her voice breaking through the quiet with the force of her newfound strength. Now I know that there's no shame in exposing an evil act, even if they are your family members. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, as if searching for something, and then they settled back on the judge. I am here today, standing before you, because I don't want anyone else to go through what he has been doing to me. I want to stop him from doing this to anyone else. The judge, who had been listening intently, nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the bravery of the young girl before him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath in the face of such raw courage. Her testimony was a pivotal moment, not just in the trial, but in her own life. She had carried the weight of this secret for too long, and now, finally, she was free. Free from the shame that had been unjustly placed on her. Free from the guilt she had carried for so many years, and free from the grip of the man who had manipulated and controlled her. She stepped down from the witness stand, knowing that while this chapter of her life was painful, it was also the beginning of something new. She had broken the silence, and that silence which had protected her abuser for so long was finally shattered. Amara's testimony was heart-wrenching. Her vulnerability in that moment was a testament to her strength, her decision to speak out despite her fear. And as she finished, there was no denying it. Patrick had victimized these girls just as he has done to Ada. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The shock, the realization that this man had preyed on so many innocent young girls, hung in the air like a suffocating cloud. But in the midst of the horror, there was something else, a sense of unity, of resilience. These girls had found their voices, and in doing so, they had given strength to one another. Finally, it was the day of the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge rose to deliver the verdict. Ada held her breath, her hands trembling, but she knew deep down that justice was within reach. The courtroom was shrouded in tense silence as the judge adjusted her glasses. Her demeanor grave and resolute. Ada sat motionless, her fingers trembling as she awaited the verdict. "Mr. Patrick," the judge began, her voice firm, "this court has thoroughly examined the evidence presented, including the expert analysis of the voice recording you claimed to be AI generated. The expert analysis has proven that the voice recording is real. Your attempt to evade accountability by alleging the involvement of artificial intelligence was not only a desperate ploy, but an affront to the dignity of the victims and the integrity of this court. Furthermore, the testimonies of the girls, the 2 brave minors, and the 2 young adults who have come forward with their accounts of your reprehensible actions have been consistent, credible, and corroborative. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You have not only violated the trust of your victims, but also betrayed the moral and ethical standards that bind us as a society." She paused, looking directly at the defendant. Under Section 31 of the Child Rights Act, sexually abusing minors is a crime, punishable by life imprisonment. For your crime against the adult victims, the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015 sets a punishment of up to 14 years in prison. While this court recognizes both offenses, the life sentence for your actions against the minors takes precedence. This court, therefore, sentences you to life imprisonment. Let this serve as a warning that the law will always protect the vulnerable, both children and adults, and ensure that offenders face justice. The gavel struck decisively, signaling the conclusion of the trial. As Patrick was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Ada sat in the witness stand, her heart pounding. She felt a heavy weight lift off her shoulders as the realization set in. This wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for all the victims who had suffered in silence, and for future victims who would now be spared from going through what she had endured. Weeks after the trial was concluded, Ada began to rebuild her life. The road to healing was long, filled with both progress and setbacks, but with each step, she grew stronger. She found herself navigating the complicated journey of healing and pregnancy. The emotional scars were deep, but her faith remained her anchor. Through tears and prayers, she held on to one truth: God could turn her pain into something meaningful. Her church, recognizing the power of her testimony, organized a seminar on evangelism safety. During the event, Pastor Nnamdi spoke to the congregation about the importance of vigilance, of going out in pairs and avoiding isolated situations. We must be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, he urged. Ada, still healing but determined, shared her testimony at the seminar. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke of God's faithfulness through the darkest moments, her courage grew. She urged others to never lose hope, to trust in God's plan even when faced with unimaginable trials. As she finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment before the congregation erupted in applause, their support overwhelming. Ada realized in that moment that this was only the beginning of her journey, not just of healing, but of helping others, of ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in silence as she had. Few months later, on one chilly morning, as the sun painted the sky in soft hues of gold, Ada went into labor. Her church community, who had stood by her throughout the ordeal, rallied around her. Deaconess Ifeoma was by her side, holding her hand as she endured the hours of labor. Ada's cries of pain echoed through the room, but so did her prayers. "Oh Lord, please give me strength," she whispered between contractions. Finally, the cries of a newborn filled the room. Ada's heart swelled as the midwife placed a healthy baby boy in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, marveling at his tiny fingers and peaceful expression. Despite the circumstances of his conception, Ada looked at him with nothing but love. She named him Daniel, inspired by the biblical figure who stood strong in the face of adversity. "He will grow up to be a man of faith," Ada declared, her voice filled with conviction. God has a purpose for his life. Raising Daniel wasn't easy. Ada faced whispers and judgment from some members of the community, but she refused to let their opinions define her or her son. She poured her heart into raising Daniel, teaching him the word of God from an early age. As Daniel grew, his love for God became evident. He would stand on a small stool in the living room and preach to his stuffed animals. Ada would watch from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. "God has a plan for you, my son," she often told him during their nightly prayers. "You are not a mistake, you are a blessing." Daniel's passion for God only deepened as he got older. He asked to be baptized, saying, "I want to show the world that I belong to Jesus." At 18, he began leading Bible study groups at school, drawing classmates with his wisdom and kindness. But it wasn't just his knowledge of the Bible that touched people. It was his testimony. Even as a teenager, Daniel wasn't afraid to share the story of his mother's resilience and God's faithfulness. "My mother is the strongest person I know," he would say. "Her faith saved her, and it's the reason I am here today." By the time Daniel turned 25, he had answered the call to ministry. He became a pastor, known for his fiery sermons and compassionate heart. His church quickly grew, attracting people from all walks of life. Many were drawn to him because of his transparency. "I am a living proof that God can turn ashes into beauty," Daniel would often say during his sermons. "My life began in darkness, but God used it to bring light to others. No matter how broken your story may seem, God can write a beautiful ending. He did it for me. He did it for my mother. He can do it for you." His words resonated with those who felt broken, giving them hope that their past didn't have to define their future. Over the years, Daniel's ministry expanded. He organized outreach programs, built schools and orphanages, and led countless evangelism crusades. He led revivals that drew thousands, spreading message of hope, redemption, and the transformative power of God's love. One of the most significant achievements was the establishment of a ministry focused on helping victims of abuse. He named it Grace Restored, a tribute to his mother's journey and a testament to the healing power of faith. Through counseling, support groups, and community outreach, the ministry helped countless individuals find their voice and rebuild their lives. One of Daniel's most profound moments came during a church service where his mother shared her full testimony for the first time. Standing before a packed congregation, Ada recounted her journey, the pain, the trial, and the joy of raising Daniel. "When I held Daniel for the first time in my hands," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I didn't know how I would face the future, but God showed me that what the enemy meant for evil, he could turn into good. The congregation erupted in applause. Many moved to tears. Daniel stepped forward then, wrapping his arms around his mother. "I am who I am because of your faith," he said. "Thank you, Mama, for showing me what it means to trust God." And that story was more than just a story. It was a testimony to God's faithfulness, a beacon of hope for the brokenhearted, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God's light can shine through. As she sat in the front row of Daniel's church, watching her son preach and extend an invitation of salvation to a congregation of thousands, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. The pain and trials of the past felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the joy and purpose God had brought into their lives. She whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," she said softly. "You truly make all things beautiful in your time." Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 11a. He has made everything beautiful in his time. If you enjoyed the story, consider giving it a like and do well to watch other of our videos that are inspiring and will bless your lives. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comment section and share with your loved ones. Stay blessed.